The Torpedo struck at 03:47. Seaman Second Class Arthur Beckett was asleep in his hammock when the explosion lifted him 3 feet into the air and slammed him against the bulkhead. The lights went out. Emergency klaxons began their deafening wail, and somewhere in the darkness, men started screaming. It was March 1943, in the middle of the North Atlantic, and the convoy escort HMS Dovetail had just taken a German torpedo amidships. The U-boat had come from nowhere, rising from the black depths like a shark, firing its spread of torpedoes and vanishing before the escorts could react. One torpedo had found its mark. The Dovetail was going down. Beckett stumbled through the flooding compartments, his feet slipping on oil and seawater, his lungs burning from the smoke. He could hear the hull groaning around him, the sound of steel giving way, of rivets popping like gunshots. He found the ladder to the upper deck and climbed, his hands slick with something he didn't want to identify. When he reached the open air, he saw the convoy stretched across the moonlit sea. 43 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and ammunition to a Britain that was slowly starving. And he saw the U-boats. Not one, not two, at least a dozen periscopes cutting through the waves like fins. A wolf pack. The largest concentration of German submarines Beckett had ever seen, and they were positioning for a massacre. The Dovetail sank in 11 minutes. Beckett was one of 43 survivors out of a crew of 212. He was pulled from the freezing water by a corvette that couldn't stop to search for more, because the U-boats were already attacking the convoy. By dawn, 14 merchant ships had been torpedoed. 9 went down. Over 600 merchant sailors died that night, their bodies scattered across 100 square miles of ocean. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. But it was also routine. In March 1943, that's what the Battle of the Atlantic had become. To understand what was happening in the North Atlantic in early 1943, you have to understand what Britain faced. The island nation imported nearly everything: food, fuel, raw materials, weapons from American arsenals. All of it came by ship, and German U-boats were sinking those ships faster than Allied shipyards could build them. The numbers were staggering. In 1922, U-boats had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping, roughly 1,400 ships sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. At the current rate of loss, Britain had perhaps 4 months of food reserves remaining. Churchill would later call the U-boat threat the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. The German strategy was elegant in its brutality. The U-boats hunted in wolf packs, groups of submarines that would shadow a convoy until nightfall, then attack simultaneously from multiple directions. The mathematics were simple and terrible. For every U-boat sunk, the Germans were destroying 10 times their tonnage in Allied shipping. The Admiralty had tried everything: more escorts, better depth charges, radar, sonar, air patrols, code breaking. None of it was enough. The U-boats kept coming, and the ships kept sinking, and Britain kept getting hungrier. The fundamental problem was detection. A surfaced U-boat was visible to radar and aircraft, but vulnerable, so the Germans had learned to attack at night, on the surface, slipping through the escort screen in the darkness. A submerged U-boat was invisible to radar and nearly invisible to sonar, which worked poorly in the variable conditions of the North Atlantic. The escorts were fighting blind against an enemy who could see them perfectly. "It's like boxing in the dark," one escort captain complained. "We swing at shadows while they punch us in the face." The scientific establishment had thrown its best minds at the problem. Physicists developed new sonar systems. Mathematicians calculated optimal search patterns. Engineers built better hydrophones to listen for submarine engines. The results were incremental improvements, not solutions. The U-boats adapted to each new technology, finding the gaps, exploiting the weaknesses. By March 1943, the consensus among the experts was grim. The Battle of the Atlantic would be won or lost by attrition. Whoever could build ships faster than the other side could sink them. It would take years. It would cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and there was no guarantee of victory. But the experts hadn't met Tommy Lawson. Thomas James Lawson was born in South Boston, Massachusetts in 1915, the fourth of 7 children in an Irish Catholic family that had been poor for 3 generations and saw no reason to expect anything different. His father worked the docks when there was work to be had and drank when there wasn't. His mother took in laundry and kept the family fed through a combination of stubbornness, prayer, and an ability to make something edible out of almost nothing. Tommy dropped out of school at 14 to help support the family. He found work in the kitchen of a waterfront restaurant, starting as a dishwasher and working his way up to prep cook. The chef there, a bad-tempered Frenchman named Gerard, who had somehow washed up in Boston after the previous war, took an interest in the boy. Not because Tommy showed any particular talent for cooking, he didn't, but because he showed something else. He noticed things. "You have the eyes," Gerard told him once, tapping his own temple. "Most people, they look, but they do not see. You see." What Tommy saw mostly was the way things worked. He watched the water in a pot come to boil and understood the physics of heat transfer before he knew the words for it. He watched oil separate from water and understood density. He watched vegetables wilt and meat brown and bread rise, and he understood that cooking was chemistry, predictable reactions that followed predictable rules. The kitchen wasn't art, it was science, and science could be learned. But it was the sounds that fascinated him most. A kitchen in full service was a symphony of noise, sizzling pans, bubbling pots, clanking utensils, shouting cooks. Most people heard chaos. Tommy heard information. He could tell when a pan was too hot by the pitch of the sizzle. He could tell when water was about to boil by the change in the bubbling sound. He could tell when the walk-in freezer was working too hard by a subtle hum that nobody else noticed. By 25, Tommy was a sous chef at one of Boston's better restaurants, known for his ability to troubleshoot problems and his almost eerie sense of when something was about to go wrong. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and Tommy enlisted. The Navy took one look at his kitchen experience and assigned him to the galley of the destroyer escort USS Garnet, a brand new ship with a crew of 215 and a mission to hunt submarines in the North Atlantic. Tommy wasn't thrilled. He'd imagined himself firing guns at the enemy, not frying eggs, but he wasn't one to complain. The Garnet arrived at its patrol station in the mid-Atlantic in January 1943, and Tommy Lawson got his first real look at the Battle of the Atlantic. It was worse than anything he'd imagined. The convoy they were escorting, 37 ships carrying grain, oil, and ammunition, was attacked on the 3rd night out. Tommy was in the galley when the first torpedo hit, and he felt the explosion through the deck plates, a shudder that rattled every pot and pan in the kitchen. By morning, 7 ships were gone. Tommy stood on the deck and watched the survivors in the water, hundreds of men in life jackets, some waving, some motionless, all of them dying of hypothermia in the freezing Atlantic. The Garnet couldn't stop to pick them up. The U-boats were still out there, and stopping made the ship a target. They had to keep moving, keep hunting, leave the survivors to the rescue ships that might or might not arrive in time. Tommy went back to his galley and cooked breakfast for a crew that had just watched men die. Nobody ate much. Nobody talked. The ship smelled of cordite and diesel and fear. Over the next 2 months, the pattern repeated. Convoy after convoy, attack after attack. The crew was exhausted. The captain was frustrated. And Tommy Lawson was paying attention. He had noticed something strange.
It started in the galley, as most things did for Tommy. He was preparing dinner one evening, working at his station while the ship rolled through moderate seas, when he felt something through his feet. Not the usual vibration of the engines, something else, a subtle change in the rhythm of the ship, a faint tremor that came and went in an irregular pattern. He mentioned it to one of the other cooks, who shrugged. "Probably just the propellers," the man said. "This old tub's always making weird noises." But Tommy didn't think it was the propellers. He'd spent 3 months learning the Garnet's rhythms, and this was different. He started paying attention, tracking when the tremor occurred, correlating it with what the ship was doing at the time. He noticed that it happened most often when the ship was changing course, particularly when it was turning into certain kinds of waves. And he noticed something else. The tremor seemed to happen more frequently in certain parts of the ocean. Not everywhere, but in specific areas. Areas where, he realized after checking with one of the bridge officers, the ship had made sonar contacts with submarines. Tommy spent 2 weeks in the galley, feeling the deck beneath his feet, building a mental map of the tremor patterns. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew that something was there, some connection between the vibrations and the submarines that everyone else had missed. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night while Tommy was filleting cod. He was using his favorite knife, a 10-inch chef's blade that he'd brought from Boston, honed to a razor edge. As he worked, he noticed that the knife was vibrating slightly in his hand, humming with a frequency he could feel but not hear. He stopped cutting and held the knife flat against the steel prep table. The humming continued, a faint resonance that seemed to come from the ship itself. Tommy had spent years in kitchens, years learning to read the subtle signs of cooking. He understood resonance. He understood that certain materials vibrated at certain frequencies, and that those vibrations could tell you things about the environment if you knew how to listen. He understood in that moment what he was feeling. It was like the moment in the kitchen when he first understood that a sauce was about to break, not because anyone told him, but because the tiny bubbles along the edge had changed their pattern. It was like knowing the bread was done before the timer went off, because the crust had stopped crackling in exactly the right way. His whole life he had been training himself to notice the small signs, the subtle changes, the signals that everyone else ignored. Propellers. Not the Garnet's propellers, those had their own signature, a steady thrum that Tommy had long since learned to ignore. This was something external, something that was transmitting vibrations through the water, through the hull, through the deck, and into his knife. Something like a submarine. Tommy set down his knife and stood very still. The vibration was there, faint, irregular, but unmistakable now that he knew what to look for. And then he felt it change. The vibration shifted, became stronger, moved to the left, as if something out there in the dark water was changing course. Tommy grabbed his knife and ran for the bridge. The officer of the watch was a lieutenant named Henderson, a career Navy man who had been at sea for 15 years and thought he had seen everything. He had not seen a cook burst onto his bridge at 2300 hours, waving a chef's knife and babbling about vibrations. "There's a submarine," Tommy said, breathless. "Off the port bow, maybe 2,000 yards. It's moving left to right." Henderson stared at him. "How the hell would you know that?" "I can feel it. Through the deck. The propeller noise is coming through the hull." Henderson's expression cycled through confusion, annoyance, and something that might have been concern for Tommy's mental health. "You're telling me that you can detect submarines with a kitchen knife?" "I'm telling you there's a submarine out there. Check your sonar." The sonar operator turned to his equipment. He adjusted his headphones, swept the indicated bearing, and went pale. "Contact. Bearing 270, range approximately 2,000 yards, moving left to right." He looked up at Henderson. "Sir, the cook is right."
Henderson ordered general quarters. The Garnet turned to attack, acquiring the contact on sonar and prosecuting it with depth charges. The submarine, a Type 7 U-boat that had been positioning for a torpedo run on the convoy, was forced deep and lost contact with its target. No kill, but no torpedoes fired either, and Tommy Lawson had made his first detection. The captain of the Garnet, Commander William Reese, was a practical man who had spent too many months watching ships die to dismiss anything that might help. When Henderson reported the incident, Reese didn't laugh. He didn't call Tommy crazy. He called Tommy to his cabin and asked him to explain. Tommy tried. He talked about resonance, about vibration frequencies, about how the human body could sense things that instruments might miss. He demonstrated with his knife, showing how it hummed against the steel surfaces when certain vibrations were present. He admitted that he didn't fully understand the physics. He was a cook, not an engineer, but he was certain about what he was feeling. "So you're telling me," Reese said, "that you can feel submarine propellers through the hull?" "Yes, sir." "Even when sonar can't detect them?" "I think there are frequencies that sonar doesn't pick up well, low frequencies, but the hull picks them up, and the knife amplifies them. It's like a tuning fork." Reese was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I should have you sent to the brig for coming on my bridge with a weapon. Instead, I'm going to give you permission to do something that will probably get us both court-martialed. You're going to set up in the engine room. It's the lowest point in the ship, closest to the hull. And every time you feel something, you're going to report it to the bridge immediately. If this works, I'll put you in for a commendation. If it doesn't, you go back to the galley and we never speak of this again." Tommy set up his station in the engine room that same night. He brought his knife, a notepad, and a direct phone line to the bridge. The engine crew thought he was insane, but he sat there in the heat and the noise, his bare feet pressed against the deck plates, his knife resting on a steel beam, and he listened. The first test came 2 nights later. Tommy felt the vibration at 0215, a faint tremor that didn't match any of the ship's normal signatures. He called the bridge. "Contact, bearing approximately 320, range unknown, moving toward us." The sonar operator searched the bearing and found nothing, but Reese ordered the ship to turn toward the indicated bearing, and 5 minutes later, sonar made contact. A submarine, bearing 325, range 3,000 yards and closing. The Garnet attacked. The U-boat dove. Depth charges rained down, and this time oil and debris rose to the surface. A confirmed kill, the Garnet's second of the war. Tommy Lawson had detected the submarine a full 5 minutes before sonar. From that moment on, nobody called him crazy anymore. Over the next 3 months, Tommy Lawson transformed from a cook with a strange hobby into the most valuable detection asset in the North Atlantic. Word spread through the escort fleet about the Garnet's human sonar, the cook who could feel submarines through the hull. Some captains laughed. Others requested transfers to the Garnet's convoy group. Tommy refined his technique constantly. He experimented with different positions in the ship, finding that the engine room gave the best sensitivity for low-frequency vibrations, while the forward compartments were better for high-frequency signals. He created a system of notation, recording the characteristics of different vibration patterns and correlating them with submarine contacts. He learned to distinguish between surfaced submarines, louder and more regular, and submerged ones, quieter, more erratic. He could estimate range based on signal strength and bearing based on which side of the knife vibrated more strongly. He developed a mental catalog of submarine signatures. A Type 7 U-boat sounded different from a Type 9. The larger boat had bigger propellers that produced lower frequencies. A submarine at high speed was easy to detect. One creeping at 2 knots was almost invisible. He learned that certain sea conditions, rough water, strong currents, masked the vibrations, while calm seas amplified them. The numbers spoke for themselves. In the 3 months before Tommy started his detection work, the Garnet had made 7 submarine contacts, resulting in 1 confirmed kill and 2 probable damages. In the 3 months after, the ship made 23 contacts, resulting in 4 confirmed kills, 3 probable kills, and countless attack runs that drove submarines away from the convoys.
More importantly, the convoys the Garnet escorted started surviving. Ship losses dropped by half, then by half again. Merchant sailors started requesting assignment to Garnet convoys, knowing that their chances of reaching Britain were better with the magic knife on their side. The Admiralty noticed. In June 1943, a team of scientists and engineers arrived aboard the Garnet to study Tommy's technique. They were skeptical at first.
The idea that a cook could detect submarines better than purpose-built sonar seemed absurd, but they watched him work, analyzed his data, and gradually came to understand what he had discovered. The answer was infrasound, sound waves below the range of human hearing, which traveled farther through water than the higher frequency sounds that sonar was designed to detect. German submarine propellers produced distinctive infrasonic signatures that the ship's hull picked up and transmitted through the structure. Tommy's knife, balanced on a steel surface, acted as a resonance amplifier, making the vibration strong enough for human senses to perceive. It was, the scientists realized, brilliant. Not because Tommy had invented new technology, but because he had found a way to use existing technology, the ship itself, in a way that no one had ever imagined. "A cook who understands acoustics better than your entire department, Doctor," Commander Reese told the lead scientist. "Sometimes the experts miss what the amateurs see." The Germans knew something was wrong. Their U-boat commanders reported increasingly effective Allied countermeasures, contacts being detected at ranges that should have been impossible, attack runs being disrupted before they could develop. Intelligence analysts in Berlin studied the patterns and concluded that the British must have developed some new detection technology. They weren't entirely wrong, but they were looking for a sophisticated electronic system, not a cook with a kitchen knife. The U-boat command responded by changing tactics. They ordered their submarines to reduce speed during approaches, minimizing propeller noise. They developed new attack patterns, coming in at angles that they thought would avoid detection. They even experimented with different propeller designs, trying to reduce their infrasonic signature. None of it worked for Tommy. He adapted to each change, learning to read the new signatures, adjusting his detection thresholds. When the submarines slowed down, he learned to pick up the fainter vibrations. When they changed their approach angles, he developed a method for detecting bearing changes. The ocean talked to him through the hull, and he had learned its language. By late summer 1943, the Germans had identified the Garnet as a priority target. A wolf pack of 8 U-boats was assembled with orders to find and destroy the American escort. Tommy felt them coming 3 days before they arrived. September 14, 1943. The convoy was 2 days out of Halifax, 41 ships carrying troops and supplies for the build-up toward D-Day. The Garnet was leading the port escort screen, with Tommy stationed in his usual position in the engine room. At 0200, Tommy felt the first contact, then another, then another. Within an hour, he had counted 8 distinct signatures, all converging on the convoy from different directions. It was the largest concentration of U-boats he had ever detected. He called the bridge with the bad news. Commander Reese didn't hesitate. He ordered the convoy to make an emergency turn, signaled the other escorts to tighten the screen, and told Tommy to keep tracking. What followed was the longest night of Tommy Lawson's life. For 7 hours, he sat in the engine room, his knife pressed against the deck, tracking the movements of 8 submarines as they tried to penetrate the convoy's defenses. He called out bearings and ranges in a constant stream, his voice hoarse, his hands cramping from holding the knife in position. The escorts used his information to intercept each approach, dropping depth charges that kept the U-boats deep and blind. The submarines tried everything. They attacked from the surface and were driven under by escort gunfire. They attacked submerged and were detected by Tommy's vibration tracking. They tried to slip through gaps in the screen and found escorts waiting for them. They coordinated their approaches to overwhelm the defenses, and Tommy tracked them all, his mind holding 8 separate contacts simultaneously. At 0345, 3 submarines attacked simultaneously from different directions. Tommy tracked all 3. At 0412, a submarine got within torpedo range of a troop ship carrying 2,000 soldiers. Tommy felt it change course for the attack run and gave a warning with 30 seconds to spare. At 0530, Tommy felt something strange. One of the submarines had stopped its propellers and was gliding silently. He couldn't track it precisely, but he could feel the void it created in the background noise. The escort saturated the area with depth charges, and the submarine was forced to restart its engines to evade, at which point Tommy had it again. By dawn, not a single torpedo had been fired on the convoy. 2 U-boats had been sunk, 3 more damaged. 41 ships, 3,800 sailors and soldiers, all of them reached Britain safely, because a cook from South Boston sat in an engine room with a kitchen knife and felt the enemy coming. The September convoy was Tommy Lawson's masterpiece, but it was also the beginning of the end of his secret war. In October 1943, the Garnet took a torpedo. Not from the submarines Tommy was tracking, he had detected those and the escorts had driven them off, but from a lone U-boat that had been lying silent on the bottom, its engines off, waiting for a target of opportunity. Tommy couldn't detect a submarine that wasn't moving, and this one had simply waited until the Garnet passed overhead, then risen and fired. The torpedo struck forward, destroying the sonar dome and flooding several compartments. 17 men died, including 3 of Tommy's friends from the galley. The ship survived, barely, but its hunting days were over. Tommy was in the engine room when the torpedo hit. The explosion threw him against a bulkhead, and he spent 3 weeks in the hospital with a fractured collarbone and ruptured eardrums. The doctors told him his hearing would recover, mostly. They were right about the mostly. For the rest of his life, Tommy had a faint ringing in his left ear, a constant reminder of the torpedo he hadn't felt coming. The Garnet limped into port for repairs that would take 6 months. Tommy was transferred to the escort carrier USS Block Island, where his technique didn't work as well. Aircraft carriers were bigger, noisier, with more machinery to confuse the vibration signatures. But by then, it didn't matter as much. The scientists who had studied Tommy's technique had developed improved hydrophone systems based on his insights. The new equipment wasn't as sensitive as Tommy's knife and bare feet method, but it could be installed on every ship in the fleet. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned. May 1943 became known as Black May in German naval history, with 41 U-boats lost in a single month. By the end of 1943, the U-boat threat was effectively contained. Ships were reaching Britain in unprecedented numbers. The invasion of Europe was possible. Tommy Lawson's contribution to this victory was never publicly acknowledged. The Navy didn't want the Germans to know about the infrasound detection technique. Tommy received a Bronze Star for meritorious service in combat operations, a medal that thousands of sailors received for far less remarkable achievements. His name doesn't appear in any history of the Battle of the Atlantic. The records show that his detection technique contributed to 27 confirmed submarine contacts during his time aboard the Garnet, resulting in 5 confirmed kills, 4 probable kills, and the successful defense of 11 convoys carrying over 40,000 troops and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. Those 11 convoys alone represented nearly 100 ships and perhaps 15,000 lives saved. But the official tally doesn't capture the full impact. Tommy's insights about infrasound detection influenced the development of acoustic systems that remained in use throughout the Cold War. His approach, using the ship itself as a sensor, became a principle of naval design that persists to this day. A cook with a knife changed the way navies listened to the ocean. The war ended in May 1945. Tommy was discharged in October with his Bronze Star and his memories, and not much else. He went back to Boston. He opened a small diner in Borchester, cooking for dock workers and factory hands and the same kind of working people he'd grown up with. He married a woman named Mary Catherine, had 3 children, and never spoke publicly about his contribution to the war. When people asked about his Navy service, he said he'd been a cook, which was true. The transition to civilian life was harder than he expected. After 2 years of listening to death in every vibration, ordinary sounds seemed muted, meaningless. He would stand in his diner kitchen and feel the floor beneath his feet, waiting for a signal that never came. But eventually the nightmares faded, and Tommy learned to be a civilian again. He kept the knife, the same 10-inch chef's blade he'd brought from his pre-war kitchen, and used it every day until he retired in 1978. His children remembered him holding it sometimes, running his thumb along the edge, staring at nothing. They didn't understand what he was listening for. In 1987, a naval historian researching acoustic detection techniques came across references to Lawson's method in classified documents from the 1940s. He tracked down Tommy, then 72 years old and still living in Dorchester. The historian wanted to interview him for a book about unsung heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic. Tommy talked for 4 hours. He explained his technique, the science behind it, the nights in the engine room with his knife pressed against the deck. He talked about the men who died and the men who lived, about Commander Reese and the Wolfpack attack and the torpedo that finally got them. He talked about the diner and Mary Catherine and how strange it was to go back to civilian life after spending 2 years listening to the ocean try to kill him. The historian asked if Tommy felt cheated, if he resented the lack of recognition. Tommy shook his head. He said, "I was a cook. I did what I was told to do, and I did it as well as I could. The boys who died in the water, they're the ones who deserved medals. I just listened. Anyone could have done it. I was just the one who noticed." Tommy died in 1994 at the age of 79. His gravestone lists his name, his dates, and a single line: Ship's Cook 3rd Class, USN, 1942 to 1945. It doesn't mention the submarines. It doesn't mention the convoys. It doesn't mention the 3,800 lives saved in a single night. But the sailors who survived those convoys remembered, and somewhere in the archives of naval research laboratories, classified documents still refer to Lawson's method, the technique that a cook from South Boston invented by paying attention to what everyone else had missed.
There's a lesson in Tommy Lawson's story, though it's not the one you might expect. It's not about technology, though Tommy's technique was based on physics that the experts hadn't considered. It's not about heroism, though what he did in that engine room was as brave as anything that happened on the beaches of Normandy. The lesson is about seeing, or in Tommy's case, about feeling. Every sailor on every escort ship in the Atlantic felt the same vibrations that Tommy felt. They walked on the same deck plates, stood in the same engine rooms, experienced the same subtle tremors when submarines were near. But only Tommy, a cook from South Boston who had learned to read the small signs of a kitchen, understood what those vibrations meant. The experts had sonar and radar and hydrophones. They had scientists and engineers and years of research. They had every advantage that money and education could provide, and they missed what a cook discovered with a kitchen knife and bare feet. Old Gerard, the bad-tempered French chef who had first noticed Tommy's gift, had said it best: "Most people look but do not see." Tommy saw. Tommy felt. And because he paid attention to what everyone else ignored, thousands of men lived who would otherwise have died in the cold waters of the Atlantic. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't firepower or technology or brilliant strategy. Sometimes it's just one person noticing what everyone else missed and having the courage to speak up. One cook, one knife, one night, 3,800 lives. That's the story they never told you about the Battle of the Atlantic. That's the missing page. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Stories like Tommy's, the forgotten heroes, the ordinary people who did extraordinary things, they deserve to be remembered. If you want to hear more of them, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. Until next time.